Hi guys, we are opening Module 6 this week, looking at contemporary theater, starting at around 1915 and working up to the present day. And the chief focus of this lecture is going to be the term modernism. Modernism in theater. Modernism can be defined as a philosophical and practical departure or divergence from historical practices in the art and literature, particularly in the 20th century, and it takes the form in various innovative techniques and styles. Um, in layman's terms, this is the period of the isms, Expressionism, Dadaism, Surrealism, and we're going to talk our way through many of those in today's lecture, but I want to talk about what gives us the groundwork for all this change. And there are several factors that lead to it. First of all, we see great innovation in theater technology. For the literally, I guess, thousands of years that we've been looking at over this semester, starting with the ancient Greeks at about 4 to 500 BC, up until present day, we saw history break down to several large historical movements. But in the early 20th century, we see a proliferation of different artistic techniques and styles. And one of the reasons for this is the proliferation of theater technology. We began to see the use of electric lights, of electric amplification of sound, of audio-visual presentations, film, the use of electronic or pneumatic machinery to change sets. And with all of this proliferation of theater technology comes a proliferation of theater vision. Directors begin to explore the possibilities. One of the other things that has happened is the earthquake that occurs in the socioeconomic world about this time due to primarily World War I. Now, we're looking at, according to the lecture, beginning around the year 1915. But in August of 1914, Archduke Francis Ferdinand is visiting Sarajevo when he is assassinated by a Bosnian Serb. And this assassination begins a series of diplomatic faux pas, diplomatic foibles, mistakes that leads eventually to World War I within about 2 weeks. So World War I begins in August of 1914. And this war was unlike any war that had ever been fought in the world. We see an entire generation die in Europe, a generation of young men in England, France, Germany. In Russia, we see this war devastate their economy to the point that the Bolsheviks rise up and overthrow the Tsar. The world turns on its axis in a new way during this era, and it has earth-shattering consequences, both for society, but for the arts as well. In addition to the socio-political upheavals we see due to World War I, we also have great economic upheaval. We see in the 1920s in the United States, the stock market crashes. We go into a Great Depression, but that depression is not just centered in the U.S. It has worldwide implications, just like the 2008 recession had worldwide implications. And so that economic unrest is also part of what leads to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. It's what will lead in the late 1920s, early 1930s, to the rise of the National Socialist Party, the Nazis, in Weimar Germany. It affects the entire world, and we begin to see artistic change, artistic experimentation in response to these social, political, economic upheavals that the world is experiencing. And one of the earliest of these is German Expressionism. Expressionism, the representation of reality is distorted to communicate inner feelings or the psychological state of the protagonist. The term was first used in France. It was used to describe a style of painting. The famous painting by Edvard Munch of The Scream is an example of Expressionism. It developed as an artistic movement in Germany at the turn of the 20th century. But it reached its height in the era during and immediately following World War I. As is the case with many of the movements we're going to talk about today, there's no way for us to experience them. They are, at best, museum pieces. If we saw them today, taken out of the context of their day and their age, they would lose much of their significance. But we can get some sense of what they looked like and what they felt like. And one of the best representatives of German Expressionism that we still have available to us today is the film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The film was shot in 1920 by the German Expressionist director Robert Wiene, and captures what German Expressionism was all about. I mean, if we look at the pictures like the one that you're looking at right now, you're seeing a depiction of the streets of the town in which the play occurs, but they are all distorted to represent the inner psychological state of the principal character. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari tells the story of, you meet a young man in an insane asylum who is there to apparently see one of the patients. And he tells this wild story about a hypnotist who comes to town with a traveling fair. This hypnotist had a somnambulist, a creature that he kept in perpetual sleep, and this creature did his bidding. And according to the story of the movie, Dr. Caligari uses the somnambulist Caspar to capture the young man's lover and take her away. But what we learn in the course of the play, I guess this is a 96-year-old spoiler alert, but Dr. Caligari is actually one of the doctors in the insane asylum, and the young man who's telling the story is one of his patients. And so we are seeing a world through literally insane eyes. But you see in these photos from the film the sense of distortion, the harsh angles, the painted on shadows and highlights that are representative of German Expressionism as we know it. Characteristics of Expressionist drama included the fact that it was closely related to symbolism or Surrealism. It was highly subjective. Everything that you saw was a reflection of the inner state of the protagonist. It was frequently distorted or dreamlike. Characters are often representative. They often lack names, but are allegorical figures, in fact. The language is often telegraphed. It was spoken very rapidly and very mechanically. Sentences were short. It was often politically motivated, was driven by social and political concerns. As a movement, it lasted about 15 years. And its themes included the dehumanization of the individual by an industrialized society and the destruction of the family and the cultural context of Western civilization. On the literary side, Expressionism was represented by a few significant playwrights. First, it was prefaced or perhaps presaged by the writings of Georg Büchner in mid-19th century Germany. Contemporary expressionists during its heyday included Georg Kaiser, who wrote From Morn to Midnight, as well as the American playwrights Elmer Rice and Sophie Treadwell. Sophie Treadwell was the first female expressionist playwright, and with her play Machinal. Futurism is the next movement I want us to look at. Futurism, it comes out of Italy and is very different from Expressionism. First of all, in that it idealized war, whereas Expressionism was a response or reaction to the dehumanizing nature of war and industrialism. Futurism idealized war and the energy and power of the machine age. As I said, it came out of Italy. It was in many ways an apolitical movement. It did not see itself directly linked, for instance, to Mussolini and fascism, but it's very easy to see where the same mentality, the same process of thought that led Benito Mussolini to industrialize Italy was also the germinating idea that led, or philosophy that led to the birth of Futurism. One of the things that Futurism was noted for was that it ridiculed the idea of museum art, that art should not be something that is set aside and made to be something that we visit in a museum. It should reflect the energy and passion of the world around us. It argued that we needed to create new forms for a new era. And so we see in the writings of leaders of the movement like Marinetti, the embrace of the idea of the variety show as a model for contemporary theater. Futurism sought to create synthetic art. It strove to create art that was short, energized, illogical, that confronted the audience, and antagonized the audience. It was very in your face. It argued against the separation of the performer and the audience. It sought for a kind of an amalgamation of both. And it incorporated new electronic elements like media, film, sound amplification, puppetry. I think it's interesting that one of the articles we had to read for this module, the Acquire the Fire article, talks a great deal about the variety aspect of futurist drama and compares it to what Ron Luce used when he created the model for the Acquire the Fire rallies. I think it's important to note here that Marinetti would have in no way embraced the use that Ron Luce and the Acquire the Fire movement have put his theatrical practices. Most of the modernist artists that we'll look at today were very post-Christian. They were non-believers, saw the church generally as something holding society back. Luce has just taken these ideas and used them as a vehicle to express his faith and his beliefs. He has reinvented futurism and futurist techniques for evangelical purpose. Futurism is, by and large, a non-literary movement. There are scripts written for futurist dramas, futurist skits, futurist small playlets. I've included a couple of these that Mike had included in a former lecture, and I just thought they'd give you an example of what futurist dramatic art looked like. You can clearly see in both of these short pieces the emphasis on action, on sound and sensory input, and the attack on art as a static piece of museumed civilization. That's it. Two complete futurist dramas read in about 60 seconds. So that gives you an idea of the nature of futurism. Now, the next movement we want to look at is from Switzerland. It's called Dadaism, and is, in my opinion, represents the complete breakdown of logic and sanity in the arts in Europe in the early 20th century. Now, like all of the isms or movements we've looked at so far, Dadaism originates as a reaction to World War I. In this case, to the insanity of World War I, to the breakdown of our civilization and our culture that is represented by a war of such violence and such scope. As I said, it originated in Switzerland in 1916. The Dadaists were pacifist. In other words, they were opposed to war. They concentrated on nonsense and the irrational, and they questioned conventional definitions of art. The piece you're looking at on this slide is called a fountain. Now, if you think about it, a fountain is typically a source of water, of beauty. And yet in this case, the fountain in question is a urinal. So again, this gives you some sense of their viewpoint with the notion that life has become meaningless. Self-proclaimed leader of the Dadaist movement was the poet Tristan Tzara. And the movement tried to show the insanity of modern life. It tried to confront and confuse and antagonize its audience, and relied on, it was a non-literary movement. It did have poetry and drama, but they were based more on sensual or sensory input, sounds and movement more than narrative. The next movement we're going to look at is Surrealism. Surrealism is grounded in the study of dreams and dreamlike states. And you have to put it in the context of what was going on in the psychoanalytical world in the 20th century. You had the work of psychiatrists like Freud and Jung, who were beginning to explore dreams as an expression of a different, deeper level of significance and consciousness. And that's got to be understood before we can begin to understand what surrealism is all about. The movement had its birth or came from the Dadaist movement, but it was a movement that sought a higher level of meaning. Dadaism said there is no meaning. Surrealism believed that the unconscious or subconscious represented a higher plane of reality, and that it was an effort to put meaning to symbols in our unconscious mind, that it was our unconscious trying to communicate with us. And so this surrealist movement tried to create art that reflected this dreamlike state. It's principally a French movement and can be seen in the works of playwrights like Cocteau. Cocteau was a French playwright and later French filmmaker who created such plays as Antigone, Orpheus, The Infernal Machine, and his film in 1945 of Beauty and the Beast. Now, just like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari can give us some insight into what Expressionist drama looked like, Beauty and the Beast, the 1945 version, not the Disney version, the 1945 version, can give us some sense of what surrealist drama was like. It places an emphasis on a dreamlike quality to reality, and it gives significance and importance, almost symbolic importance, to small details. And so this movie gives us an example of that. One of my artistic heroes is our next focus and the champion of our next ism. In the mid-1920s in Germany, coming out of the German Expressionist movement, there was a new movement called epic theater. Now, epic theater was first written by the German playwright Erwin Piscator, but the person who made it famous, the person who is most associated with epic theater, is the German playwright and director Bertolt Brecht. Brecht was a Marxist, and so he was trying to create a theater for the working man, the working class. And so his epic theater was an attempt to communicate the ideals of the working class, to escape the bourgeois trappings of the capitalist world, and to create a proletarian theater. He wanted to do this by divorcing emotion from the theater. He didn't want audience members to become lulled into believing the illusion they were seeing. He wanted them to think, and so they were constantly to question what they were seeing. He did this through a technique that is often referred to by the term alienation, but alienation is really not a good translation of what was going on with Brecht. The German term that represents what was happening is Verfremdungseffekt. I love German because they keep putting words together to make longer and longer words. So Verfremdungseffekt, or the making strange effect. And so what this entailed was using techniques that said again and again, you are not witnessing reality taking place. You are in a theater seeing art being created before your eyes. And so Brecht used alienation or Verfremdungseffekt techniques like making sure that the mechanics, the machinery of the theater were constantly in view of the audience. They would get rid of the borders and legs that are used to hide the lighting. They wanted the lighting to be seen. Scene shifts were done in full view of the audience. Scenery was often minimalistic at best. It was just a suggestion. There was no attempt to create a realistic environment on the stage. In addition, there was the use of multimedia, the use of captions, of placards, of signs, the inclusion of songs that do nothing to really tell the story, but are there as a comment on the story. My favorite Brechtian theater piece is Die Groschenoper, which another one of those big German words where they take several little words and make one big word, Drei Groschen Opera, or the Threepenny Opera. Threepenny Opera was written in 1928. It's a reimagining or retelling of John Gay's The Beggar's Opera from 1728. And it is basically a reflection on the corruption of Weimar Germany, in the pre-Nazi, post-World War I Germany. It tells the story of the crime lord McHeath, who is the head of the criminal underworld of the London that is depicted in the play, but which is actually Weimar Germany. And so there are songs that make a comment on the action, make a comment on the themes or topics of the play, but that don't really tell the story. They'll just stop the story. The actors will walk forward and sing a song to the audience. It was all very theatrical, and it was a use of theatricality to make a kind of new relationship between audience and performer. This is something that we see over and over again in modernism. If you look back at Futurism, Dadaism, they all talked about how art should reconnect with its audience, and Brecht is doing the same thing in the epic theater. Characteristics of the epic theater, first of all, includes a grand scheme or perspective. That's one of the reasons it's called epic theater. It usually covers the history of foreign lands or vast expanses of time. For instance, one of the most popular of Brecht's plays, Mother Courage and Her Children, covers the 30 Years' War, which is 30 years. There's also constant shifts in locale. Just like in structure, they're very similar to the plays of Shakespeare in that there are multiple characters, multiple locales, vast sweeps of time and place. They also were used what Brecht referred to as historification, where he would take stories from history and use them to illustrate something else. For instance, Mother Courage and Her Children ostensibly looks at the 30 Years' War, but it talks about what's going on in Europe. One of my favorites is the Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui, which is set in a kind of reimagined 1920s Chicago, and is a story of the rise of a gangster, very much like Al Capone. But what it is literally a re-examination of Hitler's rise in Weimar Germany and the creation of the Third Reich. And it tells it all. It includes many events from Hitler's rise, and is actually a very exciting, cool play. It's one of my favorites. I don't know if you can tell, but I get very excited about Brecht. Brecht was born in 1898, started as a medical student. In fact, he served as a medic during World War I. After the war, he began writing expressionist plays. His father offered to publish his first play if Berthold would change his name. He didn't want an artist in the family. Brecht refused, however. In 1924, he moved to Berlin and began to work with several experimental theater companies. And it was there that he met Kurt Weill, and they together produced the Threepenny Opera. In 1933, with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich, obviously it's not safe for a Marxist to be in Germany. And so Brecht flees to the United States, where he continued to write and was eventually brought before the Un-American Activities Committee. Finally, he ended up back in Germany, and in the 1950s created the Berliner Ensemble, which becomes one of the most significant theaters of 20th century Europe. My other hero from this era is a French playwright, actor, theater visionary by the name of Antonin Artaud. And I want to talk to you now about him and the the theater he imagined, the theater of cruelty. Now, like many of the theater forms we've looked at in this lecture, the theater of cruelty sought to, first of all, get in the audience face. It wanted to bombard the audience's senses. It wanted to redefine how theater and its audience related. Artaud called for a resurrection of the theatrical event. He wanted to create an event that was not tied to a literary element like a script, instead linked to a more sensory experience: sound, light, vision, expression. Artaud had began his career as an actor. In fact, if you can find a copy of the 1927 film Napoleon by Abel Gance, you can see Antonin Artaud because he's playing the character of Jean-Paul Marat in the French Revolution scenes. He was not a well man. He suffered from physical and mental disorders and actually spent some time in an insane asylum. In the 1930s, he saw a Balinese dance troupe that had come to Paris and was convinced that these dancers were communicating narrative through movement. And we're not talking about mime here. We're talking about a series of symbolic gestures that could communicate in and of themselves. Now, one of the things you have to understand is that Artaud completely misunderstood what he was seeing in the Balinese dancers, but nonetheless, it gave rise to his philosophy that he captured in his book, Le Théâtre et son double, or The Theater and Its Double. One of the reasons that what Artaud was imagining is called the theater of cruelty is because of how he sees theater functioning. Artaud literally uses the metaphor of society as a pus-filled boil, and theater is supposed to be the lancet or the blade that is to puncture that boil and to relieve the pressure by letting the pus flow out. It's very similar in some ways to the idea of catharsis that Aristotle talks about in his Poetics. Least produced of the artists and philosophers and visionaries we've talked about in this lecture. The man was insane. And so there are many things in his book that have never been realized, have never been even clearly explained. For instance, he talks about lighting having a shredding effect. And nobody is really clear what that shredding effect is. But he does hit upon this notion of theater as a primal release, as theater as a vehicle to drive out the pain and the inner turmoil of society and to set us free. And so, although he's a non-realized visionary, he is nonetheless a visionary. His theories became one of the active driving forces in theater in the mid-20th century, with some of the more experimental theater movements in Eastern Europe and in America and the world. We've already talked several times in this lecture about Hitler and the rise of Nazism in Germany. And this brings us to the other defining event of the 20th century in Western culture, and that is obviously World War II. Hitler comes to power in Germany in 1933 as chancellor. In 1939, after several years of attempts to appease and keep the Germany at peace with Western Europe, Hitler invades Poland, and the war is on. America is staying on the sidelines until 1941, when one of Hitler's allies, Imperial Japan, strikes America at Pearl Harbor. and we enter the war. The war goes on till 1945, when Hitler is first that spring defeated in Europe by the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States, and Japan is defeated that summer by the U.S. with the dropping of an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Obviously, there's no way to do justice to the life, to the world-changing event World War II is in just a few seconds of explanation, but it is the redefining moment. I mean, we see the introduction of weapons of mass destruction that have been unprecedented to this point in history, with the dropping of the nuclear bomb in Japan. The Holocaust itself represents genocide on a level that has never occurred in the modern world up to that point. Regretfully, it became all too common a reality after that, with Stalin's purges in Russia, with Pol Pot in Cambodia. But up until that point, there had not been such a recorded event of genocidal destruction. And so coming out of this war, Western culture is saying, who are we? What are we? And the philosophical response to that question comes from the French writers Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, who give birth to what we call now the existential movement. Jean-Paul Sartre is perhaps the father of the existentialists. He was an essayist, a poet, a playwright. His play, No Exit, in many ways encapsulates this notion of existentialism. There is no past, there is no present. I mean, there is no future, there is only present existence to define who we are, what we're doing. In No Exit, there are three characters who are trapped in a room to which there is no exit. And they are each other's torment. There is a womanizing man who falls in love with one of the two women locked in the room with him. That woman is a lesbian, and she has no desire to have a relationship with him. The lesbian is in love with the beautiful narcissistic woman who is locked in the room. But the beautiful narcissistic woman has no desire to be in a relationship with the lesbian character. The beautiful narcissistic woman, there is no mirror in the room, and so she can only find validation by the love of a man, and so she's in desperate love with the male character. And so each of them is looking for something that cannot be supplied by the people around them. The notion is that hell is other people. Existential plays are very traditional. They are basically realistic cause and effect plays. They might be set in a non-realistic environment, three people in a room which has no doors or windows, but the relationships that they explore, the things that happen in the room are all rational cause and effect kind of events. It is not non-realism, which all of the other isms we've looked at in this lecture represents. And so the significance of existentialism isn't so much in that movement itself, but a movement that it gives birth to. One of the leaders of the existential movement is the French-Algerian playwright and essayist Albert Camus. And Camus writes an essay entitled The Myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is a Greek mythological figure who is condemned in the afterlife, in Hades, to roll a giant boulder up a hill. And every time he reaches the top of the hill, he slips, loses control of the boulder, it rolls back down the hill, and he has to start over again. And Camus is saying that this is a metaphor for our culture. We are caught in these same patterns and we can't escape. We make the same mistakes over and over and over again, and we never learn from them. A group of playwrights take this as their seminal document. And so from this, we have the rise of what is called absurdism. And absurdism is definitely a break from reality. The absurdist playwrights base their beliefs on the idea that much of what happens in life cannot be explained logically. It's ridiculous or absurd. It's disconnected. It is non sequitur. The movement takes its name from a book by the theater critic Mark Nestlin, who lumps the writings of Samuel Beckett, Eugene Ionesco, and Jean Genet under this title, Theater of the Absurd. And that's where the name comes from. Wrote the plays of the absurdist movement. Those playwrights are the Irish playwright Samuel Beckett, who actually did all of his playwriting in French. He moved to France and was there during World War II and stayed, made it his home afterwards. He is noted for plays like Endgame, Waiting for Godot, Krapp's Last Tape. Then you have the Romanian playwright Eugene Ionesco, who also wrote in French. His plays include The Bald Soprano, The Chairs, Rhinoceros, and then the Frenchman Jean Genet. He's the bad boy of the group. He spent most of his adult life in prison, and he wrote plays like The Balcony, The Maids. Each of these playwrights has a very unique message or a very unique outlook, but they all have in common this sense that there is no past, there is no future, there is only the present in which we define ourselves. Beckett, in his plays, seems to be looking at a post-apocalyptic world. If you look at Waiting for Godot, if you look at Endgame, if you look at Krapp's Last Tape, you see a group of people who are functioning in a wasteland and trying to find meaning in relationships and their interrelatedness with each other. If you look at Ionesco is looking more at the breakdown of language as a tool to communicate. In his play, The Bald Soprano, you have a dinner party that begins with non-related phrases but phrases that make sense. But by the end of the dinner party, the four guests are sitting around literally speaking in nonsense syllables. Genet believed that morality, our justification for who we are, is found in deviance. And so that by breaking the rules, we define the rules. This is why Genet spent most of his life in prison, I guess. Now, obviously, this history that we've looked at so far, this took us from the early 20th century up until about the middle part of the 20th century. And here we are now in the first quarter of the 21st century. So we've still got some things to cover in the history of contemporary theater, but this paints a backdrop. This gives us a sense of the diversity that evolves in the 20th century. And this is our starting point for this week's discussion. Thanks.